Please, cowboy, let me and my 3 kids in. The Apache woman pleaded through tears. The dust didn't just hang in the air out there. It was the air. You breathed it in. You felt it coat your tongue. You saw it settle on every living thing until the whole world was the same shade of tired brown. And that's what she looked like. Her and the 3 little ones. Part of the dust. Like the earth itself had coughed them up and left them there on the edge of a land that didn't want them. Her face was cracked like a dry riverbed, and the tears she was crying didn't even run right. They just made little muddy tracks through the grime. She was talking to a man, a rancher named Silas, a man whose heart was as hard and barren as the patch of ground his house sat on. She wasn't begging loud. It was a quiet, desperate sound, the kind of sound a trapped animal makes when it knows the fight is almost over. "Please, cowboy," she said, and her voice was raspy, broken. "Let me and my 3 kids in." The kids were just shadows behind her. 2 little boys and a girl, the oldest maybe 7, the youngest barely big enough to stand on his own 2 legs. They weren't crying. They were past that. Their eyes were huge and dark in their small faces, just watching, taking in the way the man Silas looked down at their mother. He had a big gut hanging over his belt, and a face that was perpetually sunburned and angry. He chewed on a piece of straw, just rolled it from one side of his mouth to the other, slow, deliberate, taking his time, enjoying it. The sun was a hammer, beating down on all of them. The woman's dress, what was left of it, was a collection of rags stitched together, and the children were even worse off, wearing scraps that didn't do much to cover their skinny limbs, all covered in scratches and insect bites. You could smell the sweat and the fear on them, a sharp, sour smell that the dust couldn't quite cover up. The youngest child, the little boy, swayed on his feet, and the girl, his sister, put a hand on his back to steady him, a gesture so old and practiced, it made your own heart ache. They were a single unit of misery, bound together by the rope of their mother's plea. Silas finally stopped chewing. He spat the straw onto the ground near her feet. "I ain't got no room for strays," he grunted. "And I sure as hell ain't got no room for your kind." He didn't even say the word Apache, but it hung there in the air, uglier than any curse. He looked past her, at the endless expanse of nothing behind them, as if to say, "Go on back to where you came from," which was nowhere. You could see it in her eyes. They'd come from nowhere and they had nowhere to go. She didn't argue. She didn't plead again. The hope just drained out of her face, leaving something blank and terrifying behind. It was the silence that got you. The silence of the heat. The silence of the kids. The silence of a man with no charity in his soul. She gathered her children with a slight movement of her hands, a shepherdess of a broken flock, and turned to leave. She didn't look back. There was no anger, no disappointment, just the slow, shuffling walk of someone who expected nothing and got exactly that. They started walking toward the horizon, 4 small figures shrinking against the vast, cruel canvas of the west, leaving nothing behind but a few disturbed footprints in the dust that would be gone by the next gust of wind. It was a picture of the end of the world, a quiet, forgotten apocalypse happening right there in the blinding light of day, and nobody at all, seemed to care. I gotta ask, where are you all watching this from? It means a lot to know where the story is reaching. Go on and drop your city or country in the comments down below. It's always amazing to see. And if you're getting drawn into this, if you feel that pull, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You're not gonna want to miss how this turns out. I promise you that. He saw it all from the ridge. Jedediah. He wasn't spying, just resting his horse, letting the big roan get its breath. He wasn't a man for towns or for ranches like the one Silas owned. His place was a good day's ride from anywhere you'd call civilization, and that's how he liked it. He'd seen her talk to Silas. He couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. He'd seen that particular brand of human cruelty enough times to read it from a distance. The way Silas stood, puffed up and important. The way the woman wilted, folding in on herself. And the way she and the little ones turned and walked away, headed for a slow death under the sun. Jed wasn't a good man. He'd tell you that himself if you asked, but you wouldn't ask, because people didn't talk to Jed much. He was a loner, a man carved from the same hard rock as the canyons he called home. He had a code, but it was a simple one, mostly about being left alone. But there were some things that just weren't right. Things that scraped against something deep inside him, something he thought had died a long time ago. He watched them for a minute, the four of them, getting smaller and smaller. He saw the smallest child stumble and fall. The mother stopped, picked the boy up and carried on, her own steps faltering under the added weight. Something in Jed's chest cracked. It wasn't a decision. Not really. It was more like a reflex. He nudged his horse with his heels and the roan started down the long, gentle slope, moving at a steady walk. He didn't hurry. He just moved with a purpose that was as solid as the ground beneath the horse's hooves. He caught up to them easy enough. The horse was quiet on the dusty earth, and they didn't hear him until he was right alongside them. The woman flinched, pulling the children closer. She looked up at him, her eyes wary, expecting more of the same. She'd probably been given no reason to expect anything else. Jed didn't say much. He just looked at them, taking in the scraped knees, the sun-cracked lips, the hollow fear in their eyes. His own face was a mask, weathered and grim. He stopped his horse. He didn't get off. He just looked down at the oldest boy. "You can ride?" he asked. His voice was rough like stones grinding together. The boy just stared, scared, silent. Jed sighed. It wasn't an impatient sound, just a weary one. He leaned down and with one strong arm, he scooped the boy up and settled him in the saddle in front of him. Then he looked at the woman. "The girl can sit behind me. You carry the little one." It wasn't a question. It was a command. But it wasn't a cruel one. It was practical. It was the only way. She hesitated for a second, her mind trying to catch up, trying to figure out the angle, the trick. There was always a trick. But when she looked in his eyes, she didn't see lust or greed. She saw nothing. A vast, empty landscape, just like the one they were standing in. Maybe that was safer. She nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. He helped the little girl up, her small hands grabbing onto the back of his belt. Then he just sat there, waiting, as the woman shifted the toddler in her arms and prepared to walk alongside them. He nudged the horse forward into a slow, plodding walk, a pace she could match. They moved across the plains, a strange, silent procession. A broken woman, 3 lost children, and a reluctant savior who didn't even know why he was doing what he was doing. His cabin wasn't much. 1 room, built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney and a roof of sod. It looked like it had grown out of the ground, a natural part of the harsh landscape. Inside it was spare, clean, and brutally functional. A cot in one corner, a stone hearth, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves holding a few tin plates, some jars of dried goods, and not much else. There was no comfort here, only shelter. He slid off the horse, lifted the 2 children down, and turned to the woman. "Water's out back," he said, gesturing with his chin toward a pump. He didn't wait for her. He went inside and lit the fire in the hearth, his movements efficient and long practiced. She watched him for a moment from the doorway, the children huddled behind her skirts, before taking them to the pump. The shriek of the handle and the splash of cold water were the only sounds for a long time. When she came back in, the children's faces scrubbed clean, revealing the pale skin beneath the dirt. Jed had a pot of water boiling over the fire. He was slicing dried meat and adding it to the pot along with a handful of beans and some wild onions he pulled from a string hanging on the wall. The smell started to fill the small cabin, a rich, earthy smell of actual food. He didn't speak to her. He just worked. He took a clean rag from a hook, dipped it in a bucket of water, and handed it to her. He nodded toward a cut on the little girl's arm. The woman took the rag without a word and began to gently clean the wound. It was a ritual, a silent dance of necessity. He cooked. She tended to the children. The stew bubbled, the fire crackled. The sun began to set, casting long shadows that made the world outside seem a little less hostile. He ladled the stew into 3 tin bowls and set them on the floor for the children, who ate with a quiet, desperate hunger. Then he filled 2 more bowls and placed them on the table. He sat in one chair. After a moment, she sat in the other. They ate in silence. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a silence born of exhaustion and a shared, unspoken understanding of survival. There were no words for this. Words were for people with futures and pasts they wanted to talk about. Right now, There was only the stew, the warmth of the fire, and the solid walls of the cabin holding the vast, dark emptiness of the night at bay. After they ate, he took a piece of leather tack that was split and began to mend it with a needle and thick thread, his large, rough hands surprisingly deft. She watched him, her eyes following the rhythmic push and pull of the needle. It was a grounding sight, a simple, useful action, something being fixed. A few days passed in that same quiet rhythm, the cooking, the cleaning, the mending. It was a life reduced to its most basic elements. But the ghosts were always there, just under the surface. Jed saw the marks on her wrists one evening when she reached for the water bucket. They were old and faded, but they were there, the unmistakable chafe of ropes. He didn't say anything right away. He just stored the image away with all the other hard things he'd seen. Later that night, as the children slept soundly on a pallet of blankets he'd laid out for them by the fire, he finally spoke. "Who tied you?" he asked. The question was as blunt as a rock, dropped right into the quiet of the room. She didn't flinch. She just stared into the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. For a long time, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then her voice, low and flat, started to spill the story out. It wasn't a performance, it was a confession, a simple recounting of facts, each one a heavy stone. "Sold," she said, "from the reservation. A government man came, said we were going to a new place. Better place." It was a lie. They took us to a rail yard. They separated the men from the women, the children from their mothers. I held on to mine. I fought. That is where the ropes came from. She paused, taking a shaky breath. They sold us, like cattle, to ranchers who needed help. A man named Barlow bought me. He has a big ranch south of here. He was not a kind man. She didn't need to say more. The gaps in her story were filled with horrors Jed could easily imagine. Jed listened without moving, his face unreadable in the dim light. When she was finished, a heavy silence fell between them again. He got up, walked to the door, and looked out at the night sky, a vast blanket of indifferent stars. He gestured with his head to the small fenced-off patch of ground a few dozen yards from the cabin. There were 2 mounds of earth there, marked with simple wooden crosses. "My wife, Sarah," he said, his voice a low rumble, "and my boy Thomas. Got taken by the fever 2 winters back. We were headed for Oregon, never made it. I built this place because I couldn't go on, and I couldn't go back." He wasn't looking for pity. He was just trading one wound for another. It was a way of saying, "I understand." Not the details, not the specifics, but the raw, gaping hole that loss leaves in a person. She came to stand in the doorway behind him, looking out at the 2 lonely graves. And in that shared moment of looking at what they had both lost, a new, fragile thing was forged between them. It wasn't trust. Not yet. It was a rough-hewn understanding, a recognition that they were both survivors of different kinds of wars, stranded together in the quiet aftermath. The first real threat didn't take long to find them. It came in a cloud of dust from the south. Jed saw it first. He was on the roof, patching a spot where the sod had worn thin. A distant plume, growing larger. Too purposeful for a dust devil. Too many riders for a lone traveler. He knew what it was. Barlow, the name the woman had spoken into the quiet of his cabin. He slid down from the roof, landing with a soft thud. No panic, just a grim tightening of his jaw. He went inside. The woman was grinding corn with a stone mortar and pestle, a steady rhythmic sound. The children were playing a quiet game with pebbles on the floor. "Inside," he said, his voice low and urgent. "All of you. And stay down, away from the window." She looked at him, then followed his gaze out the door to the approaching dust cloud. The color drained from her face. She didn't ask questions. She just gathered her children and herded them to the far corner of the cabin, pressing them down behind the thick logs. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was a steady whisper, trying to soothe them. Jed took his rifle from the pegs above the door. He checked the load. He walked outside and stood in front of the cabin, the rifle held loosely in one hand, pointed at the ground. Waiting. 3 riders. They pulled up about 20 yards away, their horses skittish and lathered. The man in the middle was big and fleshy, with a cruel twist to his mouth. Barlow. He looked at Jed, then at the cabin, a smug look on his face. "I'm looking for my property, friend. Barlow called out, his voice oily. "An Apache woman and her 3 brats. Saw you leaving town with them." Jed didn't answer. He just stood there, a rock, an obstacle. "She ran off," Barlow continued, trying to keep his tone light. But an edge of anger crept in. "Stole a horse. I'm just here to collect what's mine. No need for trouble." Jed's eyes were cold. "She ain't here," he said, his voice flat. Barlow laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Don't lie to me, friend. My tracker followed her right to this damn valley. Now, you can hand her over easy, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." He and his men reached for their pistols. Fast. But Jed was faster. The rifle was at his shoulder, cocked and aimed, before their guns even cleared their holsters. Rock steady, no hesitation. "I reckon you should move on," Jed said, his voice still quiet, but now it carried the weight of death. "This land ain't healthy for you." The men froze. They looked at Jed's eyes. They saw no fear, no doubt. They saw a man who had already lost everything and had nothing left to lose. They saw a man who would kill them without a second thought and sleep soundly that night. Barlow's bravado evaporated. He held up a hand to his men. "All right, friend, all right. Have it your way. For now." He spat on the ground. "But she's my property, and I always get what's mine." They backed their horses up slowly, then turned and rode away, their retreat kicking up another cloud of angry dust. Jed watched them until they were out of sight. He didn't uncock the rifle until they were just a speck on the horizon. He lowered the weapon, his whole body still tense, a coiled spring. Inside the cabin, it was completely silent. The raw, survivalist unity had worked. For now. The days that followed were different. The quiet rhythm was still there, but now it was underscored by a constant low-grade tension. The threat wasn't gone, just postponed. This shared danger changed things between them. It was no longer just his cabin, his land. It was their fortress. The bond between them deepened, not through words, but through small, significant actions. They became a team, moving around each other with an unspoken understanding born of shared struggle. One morning, he was checking the snares he'd set along the creek bed. He was focused on a rabbit caught in one of the traps, and he didn't see the rattlesnake coiled in the shade of a sagebrush, not 3 feet from his hand. He reached down for the snare. Just as his fingers were about to close around it, she let out a sharp guttural cry. Not a scream, but a warning. At the same time, her hand shot out and grabbed the back of his shirt, yanking him backward with surprising strength. He stumbled, falling back into her, and saw the snake strike, its fangs hitting the empty air where his hand had been a second before. The snake recoiled, rattling its tail furiously. Jed, without a word, drew his knife, and with a flick of his wrist, the blade flew through the air, pinning the snake's head to the ground. He stood up, breathing heavily. He looked at her. Her eyes were wide, her chest rising and falling quickly. He didn't say thank you. The words would have been too small. He just gave a single sharp nod. Acknowledgement. Recognition. He owed her his life. Later, he began to teach her oldest boy, the quiet one, how to read the tracks of animals in the dirt. He'd crouch down, his big, calloused finger tracing the print of a deer or a coyote. The boy, who had barely spoken a word since they arrived, started to open up, asking questions in a small, hesitant voice. The woman, in turn, took over the mending. She found his shirts were worn thin at the elbows and collar, and she used scraps of an old blanket to patch them, her stitches small and neat. She was restoring him, just as he was restoring her family. They were like 2 solitary trees on a windswept plain that had grown so close their roots had begun to tangle together underground, drawing strength from each other to stand against the storm. One evening, she found him by the small corral, just watching his horse. The big roan was a powerful animal, but gentle with him. She came and stood beside him, not speaking. They watched the horse together as the sun bled across the sky, painting the clouds in hues of orange and purple. The air was still, the world was quiet. In that shared silence there was a kind of peace. It was a language without words, a bond forged in the crucible of survival, stronger than any promise. He was the stone, unmovable and hard. She was the fire, providing a warmth he thought he'd never feel again. And together they were creating something that might just be strong enough to last. The supplies were running low. Flour, salt, coffee. the things you couldn't hunt or grow. A trip to the nearest town, a dusty collection of false-fronted buildings called Redemption, was unavoidable. Jed knew what it would mean, but it had to be done. He left the two younger children with the oldest boy, giving him strict instructions to stay inside and not open the door for anyone. Then he and the woman rode into town on the roan, her sitting behind him, her hands resting lightly on his waist. The moment they rode down the main street, it started. The world didn't stop, but it shifted. Conversations on the boardwalk paused. Windows suddenly needed cleaning. A blacksmith stopped hammering and just stared. They were an unwelcome spectacle. The grim, silent loner from the hills and the Apache woman who was clearly living with him. The whispers followed them like flies. He felt her tense up behind him, her body going rigid. He dismounted in front of the general store and reached up to help her down. His hand lingered on her arm for a second longer than necessary, a silent message of support. Inside the store, it was worse. The storekeeper, a balding man named Peters, gave them a tight, disapproving smile. "Jedediah," he said, his eyes flicking from Jed to the woman and back again. "Didn't expect to see you." Two women in bonnets who had been examining bolts of calico stopped their chatter and moved to the other side of the store, their backs turned but their ears open. "Need flour," Jed said, his voice flat, ignoring the tension. "And salt." As Peters weighed out the flour, one of the ranchers who ran with Barlow's crowd, a man named Cale, sauntered in. He had a mean, ferret-like face and small, cruel eyes. He looked the woman up and down, a nasty smirk on his face. "Well, well, Jed," Cale said, his voice loud enough for the whole store to hear. "I heard you were keeping company, but I didn't believe it. Didn't take you for a man who'd shelter another man's property." The word hung in the air. Property. The woman flinched as if struck. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to become smaller. Jed finished paying Peters, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look at Cale. He picked up his sacks of supplies. "Let's go," he said to her, his voice low. As they walked toward the door, Cale stepped in their way. "Barlow's gonna be real interested to know you're parading his squaw around town," he sneered. Jed stopped. He didn't say a word. He just looked at Cale. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for his gun. He just met the man's gaze with an emptiness so profound, so utterly devoid of fear or anger, that it was more terrifying than any threat. It was the look of a man looking at an insect he was about to crush. Cale's smirk faltered. He shuffled his feet, and after a long, charged moment, he stepped aside. Jed walked past him and out the door without a backward glance. He had shut him down with nothing but silence. But as they rode out of town, the stares and the whispers following them, he knew this was only the beginning. The community had passed its judgment. The confrontation he'd been expecting came a week later. It wasn't at the cabin. It was in the open, on the road back from that same town. Jed had gone alone this time, thinking it would be safer. He was wrong. As he rounded a bend, 3 men blocked the path. Barlow was in the lead, Cale and another hard-faced man flanking him. They weren't just there to talk this time. They'd been waiting for him. But they hadn't counted on one thing. The woman had followed him. She had a feeling, a deep-seated dread she couldn't shake, and had trailed him at a distance on foot, telling the boy to watch the little ones. She was hidden in the rocks above the road, watching the whole scene unfold. "We meet again, friend," Barlow said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "And this time you're alone. We've come for what's mine." "Where is she?" Jed sat on his horse, his hands resting on the saddle horn. He looked at the 3 of them, his face a granite mask. "She's not yours," he said, the words simple and final. "Oh, I got a bill of sale says she is," Barlow spat, his patience gone. "I paid good money for her. Now you're gonna take us to her, or we're gonna take you apart piece by piece until you do." Jed didn't move. He had a code, a vow he'd made to himself after Sarah and Thomas died. No more fighting other people's fights. No more getting involved. He'd live his life and die alone in the hills. He had kept that vow. Until now. Cale, emboldened by their numbers, spurred his horse forward and made a grab for the reins of Jed's roan. "Let's get him off that horse," he snarled. That was the moment the line was crossed. The moment the vow shattered. Jed's hand moved in a blur. It wasn't for his gun. He backhanded Cale across the face, a crack that echoed in the quiet canyon. Cale reeled back, blood pouring from his nose. Before the other two could react, Jed swung himself off the horse, landing on his feet. He moved with a speed that defied his size. He grabbed the front of Barlow's shirt and hauled him clean out of the saddle. Barlow landed with a heavy thud, the air rushing out of him. Jed stood over him, his fists clenched. The third man, seeing the raw, controlled fury in Jed's eyes, hesitated. This wasn't the simple beatdown they had planned. This was something else entirely. "Get," Jed said, the word a low growl. It was a promise of violence so absolute, so final, that it needed no embellishment. He wasn't just defending the woman now. He was defending his home. He was defending the fragile new life they had started to build. Barlow scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of rage and fear. He looked at Jed, then at his two men who were making no move to help. He knew he was beaten. "This ain't over," he wheezed, backing away. "This ain't over by a long shot." They mounted their horses and galloped away, leaving Jed standing alone in the road, his chest heaving. From the rocks above, the woman watched, her hand over her mouth. He had broken his isolation. He had physically, publicly defended her. He had crossed a line and there was no going back. That night, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken things. The physical violence of the afternoon had given way to a quiet, emotional aftermath. The children were asleep, their soft breathing a gentle rhythm in the background. Jed sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, his hands moving with mechanical precision, but his mind was somewhere else. He was replaying the afternoon, the feel of his knuckles against Cale's face, the sight of Barlow on the ground. He had broken his own sacred rule. He had let the world back in. The woman sat by the hearth, watching the flames. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the weight of his actions, of the choice he had made. Finally she spoke, her voice so soft it was almost part of the fire's crackle. "Why?" she asked. He stopped cleaning the rifle and looked at her. His face was in shadow, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. "They were wrong," he said simply. There was nothing more to say about it. It was a fact, as solid as the stone of the hearth. She held his gaze for a long moment, and something inside her that had been frozen for years began to thaw. This man, this silent, wounded man, had not offered her pity. He had offered her protection. He had not seen her as property or a burden. He had seen her as a person worth fighting for. The emotional vulnerability, held back for so long, finally crested. Tears began to trace clean paths down her dusty cheeks. But these were not the tears of desperation she had cried at Silas's ranch. These were tears of release. "They call me Mary at the agency," she said, her voice gaining a little strength. "The man, Barlow, he called me girl. It is not my name." She took a deep breath, a shuddering intake of air. She looked directly at him, her eyes clear and full of a raw, burgeoning trust. "My name is Chayton." The name was beautiful and strange on her tongue, a word she hadn't spoken aloud in years. It meant falcon, in the language of her people. It was a name of freedom, of soaring, of seeing things from a great height. It was her true self, a self she thought had been buried and lost forever. The giving of her name was the greatest gift she had. It was an act of profound trust, an offering of her very soul. Jedediah listened, and the name settled in the quiet room, filling the space with its significance. He nodded slowly. "Chayton," he repeated, the name tasting right in his mouth. He had known her only as the woman. Now she was a person. He stood up, walked over to the hearth, and put another log on the fire, the flames leaping up to greet it. "It's a good name," he said. And in that simple acceptance, a new world began. The world of Jedediah and Chayton. The resolution didn't come in a rush of words or a grand declaration. It arrived quietly, like the first light of dawn after a long night. The world outside the cabin was still a threat. Barlow and his kind were still a shadow on the horizon. But inside, a seed of belonging had been planted. The dynamic had shifted from survival to something that was beginning to resemble a life, a family. One afternoon, Jed sat on the porch step, carving. He wasn't mending tack or fixing tools. He was carving small, intricate figures from scraps of cottonwood. For hours he worked, the shavings piling up around his boots. Chayton watched him from the doorway, a small, curious smile on her face. When he was done, he had 3 figures: a bear for the oldest boy, a swift fox for the girl, and a tiny, detailed falcon for the youngest. He called the children over and gave them the carvings. They took them with a reverence usually reserved for holy things, their small fingers tracing the smooth lines of the wood. It was the first gift they had received in a lifetime. Later that day, Jed went to a small, locked chest he kept under his cot. He opened it, the hinges groaning. It was filled with his wife Sarah's things he hadn't touched since she died. He reached in and pulled out a small buckskin pouch. He brought it outside to where Chayton was watching the children play with their new toys. He opened the pouch. Inside were a handful of dried, wrinkled seeds. "Corn," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And squash. Sarah brought them from her home back east. We were going to plant a garden." Chayton looked from the seeds to the 2 lonely graves marked by wooden crosses. She understood. He wasn't asking her to replace his wife. He was asking her to help him start again. He was inviting her to put down roots right here, beside his own ghosts. Together, without another word, they went to a small patch of clear ground near the graves. He took a shovel and turned the hard, dry earth. Chayton followed behind him, breaking up the clods of dirt with her hands. The children, seeing what they were doing, came to help, their small hands patting the soil. He and Chayton took the seeds and, one by one, pushed them into the prepared ground. It was a silent, sacred ceremony. They weren't just planting corn. They were planting a future. They were planting hope in the soil that held so much of his sorrow. When they were finished, the 4 of them stood there, looking at the small rectangular patch of dark-turned earth. A promise. A beginning. It wasn't a happy ending, not yet, but it was a seed of belonging, sown in the harshest of lands, with the hope that, with enough care, it might just grow. If this story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories just like this one. We appreciate your support.